as I promised, we have Senator Klobuchar here, and Senator Klobuchar is one of the real heroes, of this moment in antitrust, and she's a quiet hero, not necessarily a fist-thumping hero, but we appreciate any hero we can get in this day and age. Every hero is different. In Senator Klobuchar's case, I mean, I don't know what makes Senator Klobuchar a hero. I don't know if it's because of, growing up in an America, in a Minnesota, in which the local production of crops or the local ownership of business or the local organization of newspapers was something that was valued. Perhaps it comes from growing up, in this case, the particular focus that the senator has on newspapers and the news media. Perhaps it comes from growing up in a newspaper house as the daughter of a newspaper man, a journalist. There's some people are just born with that natural gut insight, the insights of, of a Jefferson, of a Lincoln, of a Douglas, of an Anthony.
Now this is getting better.
Of a Humphrey. Senator Humphrey was one of the people who was one of the real giants of the 20th century. We do not talk about Senator Humphrey nearly often enough. Senator Klobuchar, I go to the basics here, is the ranking member of the Senate Antitrust Subcommittee. As a member of the Joint Economic Subcommittee and the Senate Commerce Committee, Senator Klobuchar has been a leader in working to implement a competitive agenda to ensure businesses have the tools they need to grow and create good jobs in their communities. She also serves as the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Antitrust, Competition Policy, and Consumer Rights, and works to advance policies that protect consumers from anti-competitive behavior and ensure a level playing field for business competition. And this is actually where it gets really good. Recently, just within the last year, Senator Klobuchar sponsored legislation that includes the Honest Ads Act to enhance transparency and accountability for online political advertisements, and the Consolidation, Prevention, and Competition Promotion Act of 2017, which is to amend the Clayton Act to modify the standard for unlawful acquisition in ways that would greatly strengthen the law and make for a more competitive, more free America in which the playing field really would be more fairly tilted. So it's a great honor to have Senator Klobuchar today, and I welcome you to the...
Well, thank you so much, Barry, and thank you. Yes, it is my mission to make antitrust cool again. And what better day to have this gathering than a day when we're awaiting a major decision here on the AT&T Time Warner case. I know most people are talking about North Korea, but we all in this room know how important that is as well to the everyday citizen. And I remember I had done a series of interviews about Russia a while back, and I was in a small town cafe near Albert Lee, Minnesota, and there was an older woman sitting with her husband and her husband's brother, and she turned around and said, "I saw you on TV." And I go, "Oh, thanks." And she goes, "Yeah." I go, "Oh, was it about?" She said, "It was about," I go, "Russia? Was it about?" "Yeah, I was talking about Russia." She goes, "No, it was about big. That things are too big." And that's right. And so I do think that the public is starting to see some of what we've been seeing, what Bill Barr called mergers that shouldn't have even gotten out of the boardroom, and they're starting to understand this. And I'm excited that we're going to have our first hearing on a substantive merger in a while, that Senator Lee has agreed to do the T-Mobile Sprint hearing, and that's going to be coming up, so stay tuned in just a few weeks, and we're excited about that. As you know, we're just seeing more and more interest in this subject. So I am interested because of antitrust and things being too big and what that means for competition. And as you mentioned, Hubert Humphrey, he once said, if you don't write your own history, someone's going to write it for us. And so that's what I'm concerned about right now. If we don't start being as sophisticated as some of these deals that are coming into our economy, history is going to be written for us, and we're going to see less innovation, and we're going to see less competition in prices. As I note, we're down to four railroads in the U.S., down from 63, and that just happens to be the exact same number we see on the monopoly board. And we're just seeing that in so many sectors, and we've got to take this on. But the other reason I came today was, as Barry pointed out, my background with journalism. So my dad was a reporter for first for the AP, and he went over to Bismarck, and then he served during the Korean War. And then he came back to Bismarck, went to the AP in Minneapolis, where he, on that historic election, the Kennedy election, which of course we'd all been rooting for Humphrey, and then we got to didn't quite make it. And so Kennedy, Nixon, and it all came down to three states, Illinois and California and Minnesota. And my dad was there with two other AP reporters late into the night, and California had actually been called wrong. It had been called for Kennedy, and it ended up going for Nixon. Illinois was something of a mess. Go figure. And so it comes down the next morning to Minnesota. And my dad is sitting there with the other guys, and he's from the Iron Range. My grandpa was an iron ore miner. Worked his whole life underground in the iron ore mines, and it's a very Catholic up there. And as my dad said when making the call that it would go to Kennedy because the votes were still out, he said there were more bars per capita than there were churches, but there was absolutely no way that the Iron Range was going to go to Richard Nixon. So he tells his boss that, and his boss calls AP in New York City, and they tell him, we're going to call it for Kennedy. And it's the whole nation's waiting for this result. I know some old AP reporters that remember this moment, and the boss in New York says to the guy on the phone, I have two words for you three in Minneapolis, be right. And so they called it, and literally 14 minutes later, Nixon conceded. It's in the New York Times after the AP made the call. And so my dad celebrated by going to a Swedish cafe for lunch. He came back to work, and the next thing he was assigned to was to write a story about 3 pigs that were caught in a ditch in a farm area. So that is journalism and why it is in my blood. But he literally went from a hardscrabble mining town in Ely, Minnesota, to interview everyone from Mike Ditka to Ronald Reagan to Ginger Rogers. And he was there at the heyday of journalism, so I was able to see this firsthand. He not only reported, covered both 68 conventions, had a column for years. He wrote 7 days a week on the front page of Metro about whatever he wanted, but he also got to travel the world. They had him cover Aldo Moro's funeral in Italy. He got to go to Sweden when they changed it so you weren't driving on the left side of the road anymore, and they wanted to know in the Scandinavian state of Minnesota how that went. He got to go to Russia many times and cover the Cold War with an in-tourist guide with him at all times. And we all know that kind of money, and he led adventure trips, looked for the abominable snowman. In our basement, there was still always in the wall, a hole in the wall where he had once had a sharpshooter while my mom was upstairs with me and my sister, who were just like 6 years old. He had a sharpshooter in our basement shoot a thing of chalk out of his mouth. And so they had a photo for the newspaper, okay? So he had quite a life, and that was the heyday, as I said. And now, as we know, having lived through that, the world has changed, and it's changed from this more thoughtful, I would say, long game investigative journalism. It has changed from people being very careful about how they sometimes verify things. It has changed from all the funding that comes with that you're able to pay for that kind of journalism, to this minute-by-minute 24-hour news influenced by one tweet and then the next tweet, and that's how it goes. News, Facebook feeds. 44% of U.S. adults get their news from Facebook now, Google mobile search pages, and of course on Twitter. Millions of Americans do, as you all know, still get their news from the TV, radio, and print newspapers, but the media landscape is changing. A lot of newspapers like my own, the Minneapolis paper where my dad used to work, have adjusted. There are papers that have adjusted fairly well to this. They have really good websites. They're able to figure out how to adjust, and they also, in Minnesota, have a very informed public that still wants to subscribe to the newspaper. So it varies by area, and it varies by what the competition is, and certainly we know that many of the big papers, like the New York Times and Washington Post, have been able to adjust in different ways, and it certainly helps when you have someone with a lot of money funding your news organization. That's really news. But platforms like Google and Facebook have improved the way we communicate and share information in some ways, but also with them, as we know, as we have certainly learned in the last few years, come risks. You don't have those reporters checking their sources. You have the fake news that comes out, and you have citizens that don't know what's true and don't know what's not true, and that is what's happened. So today, the top two online platforms account for 73% of all digital advertising in the US and 83% of new digital advertisements worldwide. And those who advertise prefer to buy the highly targeted ads that online platforms can offer, often rather than news in print or in digital news. So what does that mean? Well, between 2000 and 2016, newspaper advertising revenue fell from $65 billion to $19 billion. Newspaper circulation collapsed from a high of 60 million in print 15 years ago to 35 million in combined print and digital circulation today, and all of this has forced reductions in the newsroom. The story in the Denver Post is probably the most well-known nationally, where the newsroom went from 184 to 99 journalists in just 5 years. I remember seeing, of course, I probably saw it on Twitter, the haunting image that the journalists, the current journalists in the Denver Post, showed a picture of the picture that had been taken just a few years before, and then they took out the faces of everyone that was no longer there, keeping their own faces in, and just to show all of those people that had been laid off. And by the way, this is during a time when there's huge news going on all the time. Or the Pottstown Mercury in Pennsylvania cut its staff from 73 to 10. In my state, the St. Paul Pioneer Press reduced its staff to 60, and that's the sort of the competitor newspaper to the Minneapolis paper. So if news organizations can't find the resources they need to fund quality journalism, I think we all know the answer. There will be less quality journalism. And while large papers with national or global circulation also face challenges in replacing lost ad revenue, they've had some success in using subscription-based revenue models. And of course, I mentioned that with some of the bigger newspapers. But what we do know is that fewer voices participating in the national debate is not acceptable, and certainly we're living at a time where breaking that down on the local level, where you may have major national investigations going on certain topics with them all competing against each other, but when you don't have the resources at the local level, then we're going to have a breakdown in our democracies at the local level, because you don't have journalists figuring out if there's corruption at City Hall, or if there are things going on at the state legislature, or how a bill really goes through. And it's very difficult to believe that a lot of these national organizations are going to be focused on those kinds of stories. We, at the same time, are getting attacks on journalism, and this is coinciding with the bleeding of the resources. We have, of course, someone in the White House who, as someone pointed out, wakes up and tweets whatever he wants in the morning, but doesn't respect the amendment that allows you to do that. And that's the daily attacks on the freedom of the press. And as I've said many times, there are no alternative facts, there are just facts. And that makes it harder as well. But to me, that makes it even more important that we have strong journalism if you're going to have attacks on it from that high a level. And you have to protect the First Amendment. So all of this, the attacks from the highest levels on journalism, the bleeding of the resources, raises one big question. How do we support journalism, which we know is so important to this democracy, and how do we keep it going, and what is the role of the online platforms who's kind of taken up a lot of that revenue? So, news publishers and journalists have been raising concerns about online publishers for years. We know that. A recent survey found that almost half of news publishers were more worried about the power and influence of online platforms than they have ever been, even the year before. News publishers, of course, compete directly with the platforms for advertising revenue, but they also rely on platforms to find an audience. Google, for example, directs 10 billion clicks a month to news publishers, and Facebook has 2 billion users. Platforms hold tremendous power over news publishers, and this has resulted in all sorts of issues, like how platforms may not provide sufficient branding for news publishers, or how platforms' proprietary algorithms, which determine what users see, allow the platforms to exercise near total control over the news content that reaches readers. And as someone that wants to get her own content out, changing algorithms are also hilarious as I try to second guess what's going to work. This last week I tried doing tweets at midnight just to see what would happen in the morning. It actually was really successful. I don't know what it meant or what algorithm. Maybe I tapped into the weird algorithm because not many other people were doing tweets at that time. But it is really a crazy time, and I'm just talking about as an individual. But if you look at what's happening with if you're a news organization trying to get your information out. Platforms, publishers' ability to attract subscribers, and this is issues about platforms not supporting publishers' ability to attract subscribers when they impose click-through policies that force publishers to provide free content. And then the major platforms, as we know, have made some progress in addressing these concerns, and both Google and Facebook have also made some investments in promoting news and journalism. But we must do more if we want to keep the profession of journalism alive and if we want to keep this important part of our democracy alive. I know that Facebook is going to be on your next panel, and I appreciate that. The participation is critical, and we all need to work together to foster a free, competitive media environment. So that's a piece of it. Second, we have to stand our ground that media consolidation is not part of the solution here. Some say that media consolidation will give media companies the scale to negotiate with and compete with large tech companies. Senior officials at the current FCC, as opposed to the old FCC. You're not old, I mean the current thing. Chairman Wheeler, seem to share a similar view, at least with respect to broadcast media, but that approach to me doesn't make sense. As a ranking member of the Antitrust Subcommittee, I've worked to prevent excessive concentration that can increase prices and reduce quality and choice for consumers. The evidence shows that competition, not consolidation, fosters small business growth, increases innovation, and reduces inequality. This dynamic is going to play out, as we know, when it comes to media, where consolidation threatens to crowd smaller media outlets out of the game. Take Sinclair Broadcasting pending acquisition of Tribune Media. As I pointed out to the Justice Department and the FCC, the proposed merger raises obvious and troubling competitive issues and may undermine localism and diversity in broadcast news coverage. And as the FCC moves to weaken regulations relating to competition in local media markets, we have a media industry that is primed for yet more consolidation. And this is particularly troubling when we are at a point when we need more innovation and more opportunities to hear from voices that we haven't heard from. Mergers and acquisitions, even if they are legal, are not the way to save local journalism and to ensure a free and vibrant press. The Justice Department has acted to block anti-competitive mergers of competing local papers in the past, like when it stopped the owner of the LA Times from buying the Orange County Register. It's a telling example. The Register was eventually bought by an investment fund that owns a number of local papers. The fund's apparent strategy, known as brand harvesting, has been to reduce investment and lay off employees at its papers while raising subscription rates and at the same time maximizing short-term profits. This resulted in readers paying more for less. Finally, we should be open to new ideas. Good online matters. Papers like my own, as I noted, have thrived and done well and kept up with the times. And publishers are experimenting with alternative business and revenue models as we seek. Some publications are asking for crowdfunding donations to pay for investigative journalism. Others are trying everything from micropayments for single articles to live journalism that is paid for by sponsors or tickets purchased by viewers. And there have been conversations about setting up public trust for the media. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. But one thing I do want to put a pitch in, again, is for our Honest Ads Act, because if you want to look at making it fair and the political realm for ad revenue, when you consider that $1.4 billion was spent on online ads in the 2016 election, and it's projected to go to $3 to $4 billion in the 2020 election for online ads. And if you see that migration of money on the political ads, you have to have fair rules of the game. Otherwise, if you're trying to hide a slimy ad or you're trying to do something that's unfair, you're going to move, it's going to be even worse. They're going to want to move all their money over to those internet ads. And that's why Senator McCain and I, along with Mark Warner, introduced the Honest Ads Act. We are pleased that we have received support now from Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg himself said it at the hearing, as well as Twitter and Microsoft and a number of tech companies. And I think what you're starting to see, which oftentimes produces action in Washington, is that states are doing this. They're starting to do it on their own. Companies, and especially some of the ones I've mentioned, are starting to have their own policies, which is great, but not everyone is doing it. And so if we want to have a set policy for the country where we can figure out what those ads are, disclaimers, disclosures, you name it, and if we want to have an even playing field for print and radio and TV, we have to pass this bill. I thought it was really fascinating that just this week, Google announced that they weren't going to run political ads anymore in Washington state because their attorney general is suing there and they don't have the capability to do it for Washington only. That's what we're going to start seeing. So I just think there's going to be more and more pressure to get that going. Why do I bring it up in this context besides shameless self-promotion of my bill? It is because I think that we are at this moment where we could hopefully get this done within the next year. I don't know that we could get it done before this election, but certainly after this election. And it is also a way to get more revenue and a fair and even playing field for traditional journalism and traditional media outlets, so that you don't have one set of rules for one and one set of rules for the other that pushes the migration of those ads from one to another. So that would be the last thing I would throw out there, is you're looking for fairness. One thing is for sure, the only constant of the world in news media coverage is change. What won't change is how critical journalism is to our nation's democracy. That's why our founders enshrined the freedom of the press in the First Amendment. While Barry knows they didn't enshrine the concept of monopolies in the First Amendment, anti-monopolies, because despite Thomas Jefferson's best work, they weren't able to get amendment in. In fact, when you go back to our founders of our democracy, and you go back to the Boston Tea Party and you look at what that was about, it wasn't just about taxation without representation. It was also about a monopoly in the East India Company that had a monopoly over tea, and our founders and of our democracy just hated that they were being forced to buy from one company and they had no choice. So when you combine the First Amendment in the Constitution and this strong anti-monopoly sentiment that has always run through the American spirit all the way up to Teddy Roosevelt, I think we are posed at a time for the American public to start saying, wait a minute, I think that we deserve the truth. We deserve to find ways to adapt and to have our laws be as sophisticated as the deals we're seeing and the kind of media we're seeing and the kind of attacks on the media, because no one likes to be duped. And if the people of Estonia and Ukraine and Latvia and Lithuania can see through this and have methods and leaders that kind of talk about what it means to have a foreign government influencing them, we can do that here. And that means standing up for the First Amendment and standing up for some new rules of the game. As noted by Barry, we've introduced some bills that we're pretty excited about to give the government some more resources to take on deals, as well as look at monopsonies and some of these other things, and then at the same time come up with revenue models and ways to finance investigative journalism that will give us the content that the social media platforms should be proud to put up and claim as true, so that we can use these platforms in the positive ways that they were meant to be. So that's my goal, and I hope it's yours too. Thank you for having me.